The night my husband Robert laughed at me across the dinner table, I felt something crack open inside my chest. Not break, exactly, but shift. Like a door that had been swollen shut for years, finally giving way just enough to let a sliver of cold air through. We were sitting in the kitchen of our house in Burlington, Ontario. The same kitchen where I had made 31 years of breakfasts, packed 31 years of lunches, and listened to 31 years of stories about Robert's accounting firm, Callaway Financial Group. I had set the table the way I always did. Placemats from the set my mother gave us as a wedding gift, the good glasses on Friday nights even when it was just the two of us, a small candle in the middle. I had made his favorite. Roast chicken with lemon and rosemary. Because I wanted the mood to be right, I had been rehearsing what I wanted to say for 3 weeks. I want to open a bookshop, I told him. He looked up from his plate. He had a piece of chicken on his fork, and he just held it there, suspended, and then he started to laugh. Not a cruel laugh, not exactly. More the kind of laugh you give when someone tells you a joke you weren't expecting. Surprised, almost fond, which somehow made it worse. A bookshop, he said. A bookshop, I said, with a small cafe corner in Westdale Village. There's a space available on Locke Street. Actually, I've already spoken to the landlord. Eleanor. He set down his fork. He said my name the way he sometimes did when he thought I was being impractical. With patience. The way you speak to someone who means well. You're 62 years old. I'm aware of how old I am, Robert. Running a retail business it's not like volunteering at the library. It's inventory, it's cash flow, it's payroll. I know what it is. He picked up his fork again. We'll talk about it, he said, which was what he always said when he meant, we won't talk about it. Our son, Callum, was no better. He came for dinner the following Sunday with his wife, Priya. No, wait, I need to get this right. Her name wasn't Priya. I'll call her what she was. My son's wife, Lindsay Marsh, a woman who smiled at me with all her teeth while her eyes stayed entirely still. Callum had gotten the laugh from his father, that same gentle, dismissive sound. And Lindsay had said, "Oh, Eleanor, how sweet," like I had told her I was learning to watercolor. "Mum," Callum said. And he was 34 years old, my boy, broad-shouldered and serious in the way that Robert had always been serious. Do you have any idea what the failure rate is for independent bookshops? Do you have any idea? I said very quietly. How many of your client proposals I typed between 1987 and 2003? He blinked. That's not the same thing. No, I said, it isn't. What none of them knew, what I had never told a single person, was that I had been planning this for 6 years. Not daydreaming about it, planning it. I had spreadsheets on my laptop that I had been updating every month since I turned 56. The year, Robert's firm had its best year ever, and we celebrated with a trip to Italy, and everyone toasted Robert at the dinner in Florence. And nobody asked me what I thought about anything. I had taken 2 courses through McMaster's continuing education program, one on small business management, one on retail marketing. I had read every book I could find on independent bookselling, and I had read a great many books in my life, so I knew how to read with purpose. I had spoken to the owner of a beloved bookshop in Dundas, who was retiring, and she had spent 2 afternoons with me going over her numbers, her suppliers, her lessons learned. Her name was Margaret Alderton, no relation to my neighbor Diana, and she had said to me over tea, "Eleanor, the only mistake you can make at our age is waiting for someone to tell you that you're ready." I had not forgotten that. I had not forgotten a great many things. I want to be honest about what my marriage was, because I think some people will assume it was terrible, and it wasn't, not in the ways people imagine. Robert Callaway was not a cruel man. He was not a drinker. He was not unkind with his words in the daily sense. He was not unfaithful as far as I know. What he was certain. Certain about how things worked, certain about what was sensible, certain about the shape a life ought to take. And for a long time, I had found that certainty comforting. When you are young and the world feels large and unsteady, a man who always knows what he thinks can feel like solid ground. But solid ground and a cage can look remarkably similar depending on where you're standing. For 31 years, I had been the person who made it possible. For Robert to be certain, I had raised Callum, mostly, in the practical daily sense that Robert was always at the office, always traveling, always building something. I had managed the house, the social calendar, the relationships with his clients that required a personal touch. When his mother became ill, I was the one who organized her care. When Callum had trouble in school, I was the one who sat with the teachers, who found the tutor, who drove him to his appointments. When Robert had his health scare in 2011, I was the one who went with him to every appointment, who researched every option, who researched every gather while he was frightened and she couldn't say so's. I had done all of this without once being asked, "What do you want, Eleanor? What do you think about things?" To be fair, I had not asked myself that question either. Not until I turned 56 and we were in Florence and I was watching Robert give a toast about his own accomplishments, and I thought, with a clarity that frightened me, I have not done one single thing that was mine. So, the bookshop. I made the offer on the Lock Street space in March. I signed the lease in April. I told Robert in May, after the papers were signed, because I had learned something in 31 years of marriage. It is much easier to ask forgiveness than permission, and it is easier still to present a fait accompli. He did not laugh this time. He went very quiet, which was worse. "You signed a lease," he said. "I did. On a commercial property." "Yes, Eleanor." He sat down at the kitchen table. He looked, and I want to be accurate here, he looked not angry exactly, but diminished, like something had been taken from him, though I couldn't have said what. "Where is this money coming from?" "My inheritance from my mother," I said, "and my personal savings account. The one I've had since before we were married, Robert. The one that's always been in my name." He was quiet for a long time. "What is it called?" he said finally. "The shop?" "Thistledown Books," I said. "And a small cafe, 6 tables." He looked at his hands, he said. "I hope you know what you're doing." "I do," I said. And for the first time in a very long time, I meant it. The first 6 months were the hardest thing I have ever done, and I say this as a woman who has given birth, nursed a mother through her dying, and held a family together, through the kind of quiet emergencies that nobody outside a house ever sees. Running Thistledown Books was a different kind of hard. The kind that required everything I had, and then asked for a little more. There were mornings when I drove to the shop before 6 o'clock because a delivery had gone wrong. There were weeks when the numbers didn't work, and I stared at my spreadsheets at midnight, trying to find where I had miscalculated. There were customers who were difficult, suppliers who were slow. A plumbing issue in November that cost me $4,000 I had not budgeted for. Robert did not help. He was not obstructive, not exactly. He never actively tried to interfere, but he was absent in a way that was its own kind of statement. He did not come to the opening. He told Callum he had a conflict, and Callum told me, and I stood behind my counter on that first Saturday in September, with the shop full of neighbors and strangers, and my friend Agnes Brightwell, who had driven from Guelph and brought me a monstrous bouquet of sunflowers. And I thought, so this is what it looks like when you do something on your own. Agnes had been my closest friend since our children were small. She was the only person I had told about the shop from the beginning, the only person who had known about the spreadsheets and the courses and the conversations with Margaret Alderton. She had said, when I first told her my plan, finally, "Eleanor, it's about bloody time." That was Agnes. I had never loved her more than I did in that moment. My daughter-in-law Lindsay Marsh came to the opening with Callum. She made a point of complimenting the decor in a way that felt like condolence. "It's very cozy," she said, which I have learned is what people say about small spaces when they are trying to be kind. Callum bought 3 books and was polite about everything, which was its own form of distance. What I had not expected, what none of them had expected, I suspect, was that the shop would do well. Not just survive, do well. By January, I had a waiting list for the monthly book club I had started. By March, I had been written up in the Hamilton Spectator. A small piece, half a page, but it brought people in from as far as Oakville. By the following autumn, I was running 4 book clubs, a children's story time on Saturday mornings that had become a fixture in the neighborhood, and a series of author readings that I had organized through contacts I'd made at the Toronto International Festival of Authors. The Cafe Corner, which Robert had called optimistic when I showed him the plans, had become the thing people came for first. I had hired a young woman named Frances Donnelly to run it, and Frances had a gift for hospitality that made every person who walked through the door feel expected. I won't pretend it was all triumph. There were still hard months. There were still mornings when I questioned everything. But there was also this. I was doing it. I was doing it entirely on my own terms, with the skills I had spent decades developing without ever thinking of them as skills, and it was working. Robert, meanwhile, was having a difficult year. I say this without pleasure. I want to be clear about that. I did not want Robert to struggle. I had loved this man for more than 3 decades, and some part of me always would. But the truth is that Callaway Financial Group, which had been so solid and certain for so long, had made some decisions in the previous 2 years that were catching up with it. There had been a significant client loss. There had been a younger firm in Mississauga undercutting them on fees. There had been some partnership tensions that Robert had never fully told me about, because that was Robert's way. He carried things alone and called it strength. By the spring of my 2nd year running Thistledown, Robert's firm was restructuring. 2 of his senior partners were leaving to start their own practice. The staff had been reduced. Robert was working longer hours than ever, and coming home with a kind of tightness around his eyes that I recognized from 2011 from the health scare, from all the times he was afraid and couldn't name it. I fed him. I listened when he talked. I did not say, "I told you so." I did not say, "Now do you understand what it feels like to have no one who believes in you?" I didn't say any of the things that would have been easy to say. But there was a night, a Tuesday in April, I remember because there had been a late frost and I'd had to cover the window boxes, when he sat down at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey and said, "How are your numbers?" "Good," I said. "How good?" I told him. I had learned by then not to understate things. That had been a habit of 30 years, making myself smaller so he could be larger. And I was done with it. I told him the revenue from the past quarter. I told him about the new corporate account I had landed with a law firm downtown that did bulk orders for client gifts. I told him that Francis had asked about expanding the cafe hours and I was considering it. He was quiet for a long moment. "You've built something real," he said. "Yes," I said. "I have. I underestimated you." "Yes," I said. "You did." He looked at his glass. "I'm sorry for that, Eleanor." I sat with that for a moment. 31 years is a long time. You don't spend 31 years with a person without knowing the texture of their regret. Whether it's genuine or whether it's the kind of apology that's really a request to be forgiven quickly so everyone can move on. This, I could tell, was not the quick kind. This was something he had been working his way toward for a while. "I know," I said, and that was enough for then. What I did not know, what came as a shock even to me, who thought I had planned for everything, was what Callum did next. My son had been watching Thistledown's success with what I had read as reserved approval, the kind of acknowledgement that cost him nothing, because he didn't expect it to be relevant to him. He was an architect, Callum, good at his work, busy with his work, and what I did had always lived in a separate category in his mind. His mother's project, manageable and contained. But Thistledown had not stayed contained. In the late spring of my 2nd year, I received an offer. It came through a property development company called Meridian Cultural Properties, a group that was developing a new mixed-use building in the Barton Village neighborhood and wanted an anchor tenant for their ground-floor commercial space. A bookshop, they said. A community hub. They had read the Spectator piece. They wanted to meet. I met with them. I brought Agnes, who is sharper about money than I am, and who sat across from Meridian's representative, a man named Scott Henley, with the expression of someone who has raised 3 children and is not impressed by anything. By the end of the meeting, we had the outline of an agreement that would give me a second, larger location at a favorable lease rate in exchange for a 5-year anchor commitment. It was the largest business decision I had ever made. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I walked the Barton Village space every morning that fortnight, standing in the empty shell of what would become Thistledown Books on Barton, trying to feel whether it was right. It was right. I signed. I told Robert that evening. He had been following the conversations, loosely. I had kept him informed. I wasn't interested in secrets, and when I told him I had signed, he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not pride, exactly. Something more complex than pride. Like a man who is recalibrating something. 2 locations, he said. 2 locations! Eleanor! Robert! He laughed, but this time it was completely different. It was the laugh of someone who is genuinely surprised and not pretending otherwise. And I laughed too. And for a moment, we were two old people at a kitchen table in Burlington laughing at the distance between where we had been and where we were now. Callum found out 3 days later. He came by the shop, the Lock Street shop, which Francis was running with quiet competence, while I was increasingly occupied with planning the Barton space. And he stood among the bookshelves looking like a man who has arrived at a party and discovered it's larger than he expected. "Is it true?" he said. "2 locations?" "Yes." He picked up a book from the display table, put it down, picked up another. "Mum," he said, and his voice had something in it I hadn't heard since he was small. Since the days when he would come to me with a problem he didn't know how to solve and trusted that I would. "I think I owe you an apology." "I think you might," I said. I didn't take it seriously. "What you were doing?" "No," I said. "You didn't. I'm sorry." He met my eyes. He had Robert's eyes, dark brown, direct, but in that moment he looked like himself, not his father. Just my boy, 34 years old, standing in the bookshop his mother had built. "I really am." I reached over and squeezed his arm. "I know you are, sweetheart," I said. "And I want you to know something. I didn't do this to prove something to you or to your father. I did it because it was mine to do." "Do you understand the difference?" He thought about it. "I think I'm starting to," he said. Lindsay was harder. She was not the kind of person who apologized easily. I don't say this as a criticism, only as an observation, and what she gave me instead was a shift so gradual I almost missed it. She started coming into the shop on her own, without Callum, on Wednesday lunchtimes. She started asking Francis for book recommendations. One afternoon I came out of the back office and found her sitting at one of the cafe tables with a cup of coffee and a novel, reading, and she looked up. And for a moment her expression was entirely unguarded. "Just a woman enjoying an afternoon," and she said, "I come here almost every week." "I don't think I've told you that." "No," I said. "You haven't. It's become. It matters to me." The shop. She looked around at the shelves, the reading corner, the children's table near the window where I kept the picture books. "You made something really special here, Eleanor." "Thank you, Lindsay," I said, and I meant it, genuinely. I was 64 years old, and I had learned that there were all kinds of ways of saying sorry, and some of them looked like Wednesday lunchtimes. The spring I opened the Barton location, Robert came to help. He didn't offer dramatically, didn't make it into something. He just showed up on a Saturday morning with coffee from the Tim Hortons on King Street and asked where I needed him. I put him to work assembling shelving units, the flat pack kind, which he has always been terrible at, and he swore under his breath at the instructions for 2 hours. While I supervised the installation of the lighting and had 3 conversations with Francis about the cafe set and answered 17 text messages from suppliers. At one point I looked over and he was sitting cross-legged on the floor with the instructions spread around him, reading glasses on, completely absorbed, and I thought, 31 years. 31 years of mornings and meals, and arguments and silence and all the ordinary grief of 2 people trying to share a life. There had been so much I had swallowed. There had been so much he had never understood about me, and maybe some of it he never would. But he was here, on the floor, trying to put together a bookshelf because I needed it done. "You've got 2 left halves," I told him. "You need to flip one." He looked up. "How did you know that from over there?" "Because I've been watching you for 5 minutes. I said, "and because I've always paid attention." He looked at me for a moment. Then he smiled. A slow, real smile, not the confident Robert Calloway who gave toasts in Florence, but just Robert, my husband, a little rumpled and older than either of us had meant to get. "You have," he said. "You always have." Thistledown, Books on Barton opened on a Thursday in May, which is not when you're supposed to open things. Everyone said Saturdays. Everyone said weekends. But Thursday was when everything was ready, and I have learned that readiness matters more than timing. Agnes drove down from Guelph again. Margaret Alderton came, and I introduced her to everyone as the woman who had given me the best advice I'd ever received. Francis had trained 2 new staff for the cafe, and the line went out the door by 11. Callum and Lindsay came together, which I had not expected. They brought flowers. Proper ones, not polite ones. And Callum shook hands with Scott Henley, who was there representing Meridian, and they talked for a long time in the corner about the building's design. Lindsay helped unpack a shipment of children's books that arrived an hour before opening, crouched on the floor in her good coat sorting picture books into alphabetical order. And I watched her from across the room and thought, yes, this is how things mend. Not in grand gestures. In Wednesday lunchtimes and sorted alphabetical shelves. Robert gave a toast. I had not asked him to. It was not that kind of event. I hadn't planned toasts. But he stood near the cafe counter with a cup of coffee, and he asked for people's attention, and they gave it to him, and he said, I want to say something about my wife, Eleanor. I laughed at her once, when she told me what she was going to build. And I want to say in front of everyone who's helped her build it, that I was wrong. I was completely wrong. And this? He gestured at the room, the shelves, the full cafe, the children's corner where two small girls were already sitting on the floor with picture books open on their laps. This is entirely, 100% hers. The room applauded. I felt my face do something complicated. Afterwards, when most people had gone and we were locking up, Robert helped me turn off the lights. He went through the shop, systematically, section by section, the way he used to check the doors at night when Callum was small. When we were standing at the front window looking out at the Barton Street, he put his arm around me. I'm proud of you, he said. I should have said it years ago. I'm saying it now. I leaned against him for a moment. Outside, the street was quiet. A mild May evening in Hamilton, the light going soft and golden on the brick buildings. I know, I said. And Robert? Yes? Next time I tell you what I'm going to do, I said, try to believe me the first time. He made a sound, half laugh, half something more rueful, and pulled me a little closer. I will, he said. I promise. I'm 65 now, and the two shops are doing what I always believed they would. Frances is developing something with a publisher about a regional author series. The Barton Children's Storytime has a 2-year-old regular who has just discovered she can reach the lowest shelves herself, and the face she makes when she does it, pure, astonished pride, is the best thing I have ever seen in either of my shops. I think about that night at the kitchen table sometimes. The roast chicken, the good glasses, the candle I had lit, because I wanted the mood to be right. The way Robert laughed, and I felt something crack open in my chest. I'm glad it cracked. It let in the air,